A very warm welcome to the Dr. Karl-Renner-Institut tonight. My name is Maria MALTSCHNIG. I am the director of the Karl-Renner-Institut, and I am very happy that despite those difficult circumstances we are facing, so many of you also came tonight to this debate after a long day of conference, where some of you also joined the workshops. Our event tonight, the debate, is also live streamed on our Facebook site. For everybody who is interested, the video will be available after the event on our YouTube channel and those of our partners. Tonight's panel discussion is part, and so to say, the highlight of the Vienna Peace and Security Talks 2020. As I mentioned before, we had already intensive workshops this morning and afternoon. This part of the conference, this debate tonight, is dedicated to the question of EU and geopolitics. In times of the COVID-19 pandemic and several conflicts the world is facing, also in the neighborhood of the European Union, we will discuss the EU's role in international relations. The Vienna Peace and Security Talks 2020 have been organized by the Karl-Renner-Institut together with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung's Regional Office for Cooperation and Peace in Europe, which is based in Vienna, and also the International Institute for Peace and the Research Center for Eurasian Studies at the University of Vienna. Many thanks to our cooperation partners for the good cooperation. Let me also welcome our 4 discussants tonight. 2 of them are present here in Vienna, and 2 are, as you can see here, one in Brussels, Andreas SCHIEDER, and also IRINA BOLGOVA, who is in Moscow. KATI PIRI, the Dutch MEP, will join us a little bit later. She has a delay. So let me welcome, namely, Irina Bolgova. She's Associate Professor in the Department of Applied Analysis at Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Hello, welcome, Irina. Here to my right is LEYLA DASKIN. She works at the Institute for Peace Support and Conflict Management at the Austrian National Defense Academy. We have also here STEFAN LEHNE, who is a very well-known visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe in Brussels. And also hello to ANDREAS SCHIEDER, who is head of the SPÖ Delegation in the European Parliament and is in Brussels at the moment.
Yes, greetings from Brussels.
We will start with Hannes SWOBODA, who is the president of the International Institute for Peace, who is also a former member of the European Parliament and speaker of the S&D Group in the European Parliament. He will give us an overview on the topic and also summarize the discussion in the workshops during the day, give us a couple of brief highlights. Hannes, may I invite you? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you very much to you and the Renner Institute that we can be here. Now, I don't want to give you a long lecture. I will. Unten ist gut gesagt. Should work. So I don't want to give you a long lecture, but very, very brief points. Foreign and security policy, of course, is a wide area, and we have, and this was the first panel, discussed the new issues, especially, of course, climate change and COVID-19. What the EU can do, and of course we complained also about the lack of real strong cooperation with the coronavirus issue, And we hope that the climate change issue with the new EU Green Deal and also with the strengthening of the climate policies of the EU was announced by the Commission President and surely supported by the European Parliament will give European Union something which can be called as a soft power, but you know, it's not so soft when you really go for a strong climate policy. Very much, of course, depends on the US reaction, which will be different if Mr. Biden will be elected than if Mr. Trump continues his very erratic policy. But we saw already that China, with the presentation by President Xi Jinping, followed the EU and is also going now in a stronger direction concerning climate change. So we hope at least that this climate policy, strengthened by the European Union, will be a pillar of a strong European foreign and also security policy, because climate policy is also part of a security policy, including also the question of preventing or reducing enforced migration from some especially developing and poorer countries. Secondly, somebody said that maybe it is a wish that the EU would go from an internal peace project, you know, no war between members of the European Union, to a more global power project, that we don't discuss so much the internal relation and be proud there's no war between, you know, between France and Germany, or so just a discussion about Libya between France and Italy on Libya, but think more about what can be done in order to strengthen Europe's role in general. And there was a strong discussion also about geoeconomics, that we can say and should say, not so much about to speak about the geopolitics, but the economic power of the European Union is strong and can be even strengthened by a common united position. With the economic power and the geoeconomics, of course, the question, and I mentioned it was a detail, but an important detail, also with some guests here, about the sanctions. Is sanction an instrument European Union should use more or less? What about the sanctions done by the US, even against friends like Europe? When you think about the pipeline between European Union countries and Russia, Nord Stream 2, or on other elements. So sanction is a very fragile issue where it can be useful to give European Union foreign security policy power, but can also be very damaging even in the relation between US and EU. And of course, if we speak about sanctions, automatically Russia comes into the field. And IRINA, we discussed with IRINA, who is here again, already the question is the EU not really interested to strengthen the ties with Russia, or is Russia not really interested, or let's say President Putin and his administration not really very much interested in having good relations with the EU? I think most of us at least deplore that we are in that situation, that there's more and more decoupling in a way between European Union and Russia, and of course with Ukraine issue, but also now with Belarus issue, it is in a very fragile situation. Fifth, and one last point, is the question we discussed on the Balkan. Is there a real fight, geopolitical fight on the Balkan between EU on the one hand, Russia, China, and Turkey on the other hand? Of course, you can say maybe the influence of China and of Russia is exaggerated in the public opinion. If you look to the figures, who is going to spend money and to invest, it's by far the European Union #1. But on the other hand, in the impression or in the feeling or in the media in some of these countries, the other countries do play an important role. Turkey, I mentioned, maybe KATI, if she comes, will speak also about Turkey, because now with the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean, Hopefully there will be now constructive talks between Greece and Turkey. If that happens, then this can also be a sign of a positive development of the EU foreign policy in bringing these countries together, which is not easy because one of the countries is part of the European Union, the other is the outside. I don't want to say the outside enemy, but some would feel it like an enemy. What is, of course, we have seen in the Balkans is in the last weeks, and I think will be mentioned as well, is of course that there is a parallel activity, not very much coordinated between European Union on the one hand and the US on the other hand, even if the result of the US invitation on to Kosovo and Serbia to come to Washington to sign an agreement where at the end of the day they don't know what they signed or they are not very happy about it. But for the public, again, it is the US who took the initiative, but maybe this is also an issue because anyway, the separation in many fields between EU and US is not very good because we are used in Europe also to look to the partnership with the US with all the critical elements of US policy in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and former times in Vietnam. Nevertheless, we cannot just decouple the European Union from the US, but there are other experts here. And the last point, of course, is the question also was, can the EU have a strong global policy, international policy, geopolitical role if we don't have a military? And nobody really thinks that it would be easy to build up a European military, and that comes in, of course, the question of the relationship between the EU and NATO. Many of us, at least, would think it would not be very wise to go for a strong, additional military capacity of the European Union. But the question is, can we do something if we are not going into the field of military action? Maybe we can learn from Mr. Trump, who is not going into military action, but of course he needs uses other kinds of pressure. Or I come back to the first point, is the possibility that we are the most progressive in a way concerning environment, climate change, reform of capitalism, that in that way we are leading power and not in the way of a strong military, where still the US, of course, is relying in case they need it. So that's about some of the points. Sure, there's colleagues who can raise other issues, and I don't want to take too much time, but I think you will meet some of these points in the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much, and I hand over Maria.
Thank you very much, Hannes SWOBODA, for this very brief and very informative overview. It's not an easy exercise to summarize a whole day of workshops, and you mentioned many topics that we would like to discuss in a more detailed way tonight. Meanwhile, I welcome KATI PIRI. Hello, who joined us.
Apologies for being late.
No worries. Where are you based at the moment? Are you in Brussels or?
In my kitchen in Red Zone, The Hague, in the Netherlands.
In The Hague. Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Your name was already mentioned by Hannes SWOBODA because you are an expert on Turkey, and that's also a question we would like to discuss a little bit later. So let me start with Mr. Stefan LEHNE with a general question. Almost every day we experience and we see how difficult it is for the EU to handle its foreign policy because there are so many different interests. How do you think a more coherent EU foreign policy can be reached, and also what role should or can the EU play geopolitically in the post-COVID era?
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. It's a very good question. Now, I think the EU started working on foreign policy almost 50 years ago, in the early 1970s. And if you look where it has gone, it wasn't very far. If you think that Schengen, the internal market, monetary union were all projects that started much later than foreign policy coordination among the EU and went much further and are more effective today. Why is that? I think there are many reasons for that, but I will indicate three that seem to me quite crucial. One is the attitude of the big countries, mainly France, used to be the case also for the UK, to some extent, not to the same extent with Germany. These countries consider their national foreign policy as a priority. For the French president, being a strong player on foreign policy, sort of chatting off to Lebanon, not just once, but twice, and now to Lithuania, and doing everything sort of in a very personalized style, that's very much part of French identity and of the French constitutional system. The president, if he has a majority in parliament, is a king. He can act very freely, much more freely, even than Donald Trump in terms of foreign policy. And he has no intention of giving this up, basically. He would like to instrumentalize the lead EU policy, use it as a kind of power multiplier for France, but he has no intention to give up the national policy, and that is a huge constraint. And I think the Germans have, of the three big countries, have been the one country that was most pro-European, most interested in strengthening the role of the institutions. But in the last 5-6 years, the Germans have become more French because they are more powerful. They're enjoying this role. They're still more positive of involving the European institutions, but they're also independent power player. I just saw a tweet that Mrs. Merkel has talked today to the presidents of Armenia and Azerbaijan. She's arranging a meeting with the leader of the Belarus opposition. She has met Mr. Navalny in hospital today. So she's doing a lot, basically, and one must be very happy that she's doing a lot. But it's not von der Leyen or Borrell, it's Merkel. So that's the first reason. The second reason, I would say, is the attitude of some of the smaller and middle-sized countries that very much enjoy participating in foreign policy debate in the Council. They have a lot to say, and it's an interesting conversation, certainly. But when it comes to actually sending troops somewhere or being exposed to the risks of very engaged and operational foreign policy, their societies are not really prepared for that because these countries never had really a true sort of international policy. It was always focused on the immediate neighborhood, and somehow they shy away from this kind of engagement. It was very difficult, for instance, to convince the Kronenzeitung in Austria not to shoot down the Austrian engagement in Mali because they basically don't quite understand this sort of thing. So that's the second constraint. And the third constraint is that for decades now, we've all been sort of socialized to follow the US lead. The reaction, if there is any crisis anywhere in the world, whether it's Africa or Asia, the first response would be, what would the Americans do about it, right? And because we've been so focused on US leadership, we've never developed a really sort of common strategic culture. And the fact now that this leadership is absent is not an incentive for us to fill the gap, but rather it weakens us because we get sort of confused because we have not the kind of strategic culture to take the lead ourselves. So can this be, these are sort of three very important points, and then there are, of course, obvious structural reasons which are partly the consequence of it. In most other areas of EU work, we now decide by qualified majority vote. But in this field, it has not been possible. Why not? I think for a very simple reason. The minute you introduce qualified majority voting, basically the member states accept that their national foreign policy is subordinated to the common policy of the Union. And they're simply not ready for this. Cyprus would never do this. They need the veto on Belarus sanctions in order to put a little bit more pressure in the direction of sanctions against Turkey. So I don't think this will change rapidly. Maybe it will change eventually. I think European foreign policy can become stronger, but it will be an incremental, slow process based on sort of successful experience. When I was directly involved with Javier Solana on the Balkans, we achieved some quite significant successes. I think in the meantime, somehow the momentum has been lost, but more can be done. I think with Brexit, the EU has been much weakened because the UK is the top power and with the best diplomatic service maybe in the world, or at least they used to have it. I'm not sure it's so great anymore. And of course, there are serious military power too. So it was a huge loss. But on the other hand, the EU became a little bit more coherent. And if there's strong German-French leadership, and if the Germans and the French are working with the institution and not aside from them or against them, which can also happen, then I think incremental progress can be achieved. But I think for many years, the EU will not be able to be sort of a full-fledged geopolitical power. But I would think personally that the position of Europe in the world in 50 years or so will not so much depend on whether we are fantastic at solving problems like Syria and Libya, but it will depend on how we handle climate change, how we deal with the demographic challenge and migration, and how we can sort of catch up or not be decoupled from the development of high technology. And in these areas, the instruments that the EU has at its disposal are much better than what we have in foreign policy.
Thank you very much. You gave me an excellent buzzword, or a couple of buzzwords, to hand over to KATI PIRI. Mr. Lehne already mentioned the current situation concerning Belarus and Cyprus blocking a decisive EU response on the situation in Belarus because it wants also a decisive reaction to the Turkish provocations. And the result is that there are no sanctions against Lukashenko. How is it possible to combine very different interests within the EU? Is it ever possible that, to say it bluntly, that Poland and Portugal or Sweden and Malta find a common sense in the field of foreign policy? And to add one more question, because Mr. Lehne mentioned it, what about the principle of unanimity in foreign policy? Would it be helpful to, or is it possible, like to switch to a qualified majority scheme?
Thank you very much for this question. And of course, I think we're all feeling the shame of 7 weeks after the Belarus stolen elections of the EU leaders not being able to have the sanctions actually in place. And it's a 0.2% of the European population, which is the population of Cyprus, that is blocking this in the Council. But let me first start with where we are effective in terms of foreign policy. I think, first of all, in trade. In trade is where a lot of power lies of the EU's external policy, and I dare to say even in enlargement. In the end, of course, there are always many things to improve, but I think the enlargement process of the European Union, which is the most important foreign policy tool that we have, is, of course, always with hiccups, like we saw a couple of months ago with the French and the Dutch and the Danish veto, but it is working. When we see on big issues like the Iran nuclear deal, we had a united European Union. When we talk about the sanctions to Russia related to Ukraine, to my big surprise, we are still united on this, although we know that we have certain governments who would rather perhaps have a different position vis-à-vis Russia. In the end, the sanctions are still in place. Now, of course, I think Belarus is an excellent example of where it is not working, where it doesn't matter if it's small or big, it's one member state trying to do horse trading in the Council, and with that actually makes us look embarrassed, all of us, for not having these targeted sanctions yet related to the violence and the falsification of elections in Belarus. Now, let me say there, although I believe it's very important, but of course, sanction is not the only EU policy towards Belarus. I think it is important that we have also indicated that we do not recognize Lukashenko as the legitimate president of Belarus. It's combined with saying that there has to be a dialogue within the OSCE framework. It means also saying we want to support civil society in Belarus and that the aim should be new and free elections. At least on these issues, there is an agreement in the EU. I'm not trying to save the face of the European leaders, but only the sanctions part in itself can never be your only policy when it comes vis-a-vis Belarus in this case. Of course, in this case, qualified majority would help and would be even logical. But unfortunately, to come to qualified majority vote, we need unanimity. And this is always where we have the problems. I have by now, I think, the calls for a qualified majority vote on human rights issues, at least in the Council, is growing. Much more than a couple of years ago, but we are still far from getting to that point and changing the treaties, changing the legal basis. What we are working on, and let's hope we will see a breakthrough here in the coming months, is the targeted sanctions in case of human rights abuses. This is what some countries call the Magnitsky Act, and this, we have a legal basis to do this with a qualified majority vote in the European Council in the future. So I very much hope this is something we can achieve in the coming months. Having said that, it's true also what the previous speaker said, even with qualified majority vote, there are still some issues where we see clear divisions in the European Union among big member states. Let's take the example of Libya, where we have different opinions, different strategies, different national foreign policies, but also look at China. We have half of the EU who is part of the Belt and Road Initiative and the other half which is not. Look at all the internal discussions on 5G or the role of Huawei. We are far from having one line when it comes to China. And I would say Turkey, we also have a very, very divisive, many divisions inside the EU. Now, even when we come together, I just mentioned the example, for instance, on the sanctions towards Russia or on Iran, we also have to admit when our US allies or other partners are not with us, it becomes less effective. So we have seen this in the case of Iran. We have struck a deal, including even China and Russia. But the moment that the US steps out, it's very difficult to keep that deal alive. And this is where we have to work much more also on this buzzword in the European circles, on the strategic autonomy of the European Union. But also an example, and I'm sure there are many debates on this also in Austria, we have been working together, for instance, with the US when it comes to sanction regime vis-a-vis Ukraine and all the violence and the breaking of international law that happened there. But when we come to the role of Gazprom or Nord Stream 2, we are divided again in Europe, and we have a different point of view from the American government. At least we don't have a clear point of view. We have many national interests involved there. And that, of course, is in the end, not very effective for our foreign policy.
Thank you very much. Andreas Schieder, it was mentioned before, you are also like a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and also very familiar with the gap between EU's ambitions and reality when it comes to foreign policy. And what was mentioned before was, by Hannes actually, was a very harsh recent diplomatic intervention by the US in Kosovo. You are very much strongly engaged in the Western Balkans region and also shadow rapporteur on Kosovo. How did you experience this US intervention there, and also do you see where do you see the capability of the EU to react and to keep up on this very harsh and quick initiative?
Yeah, thank you, Maria, for this question, and good evening also from Brussels to all which are following us through the internet. And of course, good evening to all which are participating. Even as we are both in the parliament, like KATI, we are on different places, which shows how weird times are. Maybe before I answer your question, I want to make some remarks also on the general qualification of foreign policy and EU weaknesses or problems on this field. The one is that, of course, the classical multilateral frameworks for foreign policy got weaker. Why? Because there are new questions coming up, there are new conflicts coming up, but also there are new powers and a new style of also political leaders in the big powers. President Trump, Prime Minister Johnson, the new Chinese leadership, which is much different than especially in global politics, than Chinese leaderships before. Erdogan, Putin and others, of course, try to play a strong role for their country or for their kind of politics. On the other hand, we have also to see that the European Union is creating a lot of frameworks for normal politics, on financial politics, on economic politics, on other politics. So therefore, sometimes for prime ministers of national governments, the field of foreign policy is one where they can at least quickly produce pictures. I would not say that making foreign policy, but at least producing pictures, and therefore, of course, in the public mindset, showing like they would do something. But I would also say taking some quick pictures is not foreign policy, because foreign policy is also following a line. So having said this, coming to your Kosovo question, Maria, I would say Western Balkans was not seen as the main field of European politics in the last period of the European Parliament and in the last Commission. I think we have to understand that it's extremely important to be present there, politically present, and to see it like a logical part of the European Union. So Kosovo, which has, of course, a problem, because also there we saw some countries run ahead to be the first to recognize Kosovo when they declared independence. Others are still hesitating nowadays and also being members of the European Union. But of course, the main problem is that for Kosovo is the relation with their neighbor or former part of country like Serbia. And this kind of talks is important to go through. And as again, there we come to the picture problem, because what the US initiative now to bring them together was simply to make a picture with President Trump and then giving them a treaty with signing something which has nothing, but really nothing to do with Balkan politics, saying that they have to open an embassy in Jerusalem, which seems also that both leaders did not know, because they looked like astonished rabbits when they saw and heard President Trump saying this. So anyway, this is not substantial politics. And on the forehead, and this we have to say that in Kosovo, of course, there was a very interesting political movement, because after the last elections, there came a government with Albin Kurti, which was different to the former governments, and also is different to the nowadays government, because they try to break up with the classical civil war elites on the Balkans and on Kosovo, and they want to make huge reforms also in the country, which would have had some changes. Also, this government made some mistakes, which was especially the customs policy towards Serbia. And therefore, this was a clear US intervention to kick out this government, create an internal fight in the government, and now having the old elites back for this, which opened the way to have this kind of picture politics then later on in Washington. So what can the EU do? I think the EU has to understand that in all those countries in the Balkans, there is a lot of problems, especially on how democracy is dealt, how reforms are seen, how quicker reforms are done in a lot of fields, from anti-corruption institutions, anti-economic reforms, but also to make this region to understand that it's not the European Union who will solve their problems. They have to solve their problems with their neighbors themselves. And there is one positive example in the region, which is North Macedonia, which understood They have to talk to their neighbors and simply solve the problem. And also this, I think, is the key issue for economic issues and others. I think this must be the role in the future, to be more active, but also to say, listen, it is not only the way to Brussels, which we are talking about, is also you have to define your ways between Pristina, Belgrade, Skopje, Tirana, and whatever the places are called. I think this is extremely important to make them understand that this is also European politics to work together.
Thank you very much. I would like to move on to LEYLA Daskin. You're an expert in the field of the common foreign and security policy. Let's catch up on the question, whether the EU member states share a common interest, and can the EU be considered as a community of common interests, and if yes, where are they? Where are those common interests?
Thank you for this question. I think I can identify relatively quickly three main strategic goals of all EU member states. The first will be the rule of law and effective multilateralism. The second would be keeping peace and stability both in Europe and its neighborhood, and also to continuously work in those regions where peace is at threat. And then the third common goal, which then again brings us to the Uber topic, is to have a strong Europe that is heard globally and therefore to become eventually a geopolitical actor. So I would just quickly like to touch upon Mr. Lehne's argument of it being natural for a country like Cyprus to use their right to veto. I also kind of find it natural for a country, any member state of the European Union, to try and work towards a stronger Europe, which certainly doesn't work like that. I think the main interest of every member state has to be regarded by all the other players as a unified semblance of interests. And I think to go back on a little bit more of the strategic level, what is a realistic definition of our own goals? I think the ambition has to match with skills and resources that are available. Coming from the defense sector, and Mr. SWOBODA has touched upon this in his entrance remarks, I do believe that power without hard power is no power at all. I don't believe that there can then again be a functioning CSDP, a functioning common security and defense policy, if we do not begin with having strategic foreign policy goals, because one is at the finishing line of the other. So there has been a definition process as for the CSDP started already during the German EU presidency, which happened with a document that is called the Strategic Compass. Interestingly, there's two risks that have been identified by all member states: cyber and terrorism. So those are the two risks that all member states can agree upon. Interestingly, those are the threats that are transnational threats. And it's easy to name the threats, but it's not so easy to name the actors that stand behind those threats. So that's where it becomes political, and then that's where it becomes tricky. I believe for a working European security policy, it will take upon member states to realize that if they don't work together at large, there won't be even used to mingle with foreign policy on a smaller front.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to to Russia, to Moscow. IRINA BOLGOVA, you're an expert in Russia's foreign policy and especially in EU-Russia relations, which we are talking about a lot here in Austria. We have heard much about the weaknesses of the EU now with the speakers before. How do people in Russia, how does Russia perceive the EU, and how do you think the EU should position itself towards Russia?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm happy to be with you virtually. It is an interesting question and quite an important one for Russian foreign policy, how to position itself vis-à-vis the European Union in the context of our long-term relations and in the context of the changing global environment. And they both are important for Russian foreign policy, and they both are important for the development of Russia-EU relations. Because if we try to trace back the logic of the relations between Russia and the EU, especially after the enlargement of the EU of the 2004 and 2007 and coming close to Russia, then we will see that that logic was very positive and talking on very constructive topics. We were dealing with the concept of common neighborhood and trying to elaborate some instruments on how to deal with the issues of security in the common neighborhood, those things that are currently on the agenda, both for EU and for Russia, and that we see that they are aggravating currently, well, not only with Ukraine and not only with Belarus, but these days with Armenia-Azerbaijan military escalation, which is not a surprise, but it is a mark of the current state of international relations in this region of so-called common neighborhood and of common challenges and threats for Russia and the European Union. So that was a period of talking about the complementarity of instruments, like Russia with more hard power and more political influence in this sphere, and European Union, which is much less partial, or at least it has been considered to be non-partial and natural mediator in different types of contradictions in the common neighborhood. For the states of the post-Soviet space, the European Union was a sort of counterbalance in their relations with Russia. And if we are talking from that perspective, then we have to admit that the European Union was at that very period of time also geopolitical, and not only now when it tries to reposition itself. So it was included in these geopolitical structures on the continent. But, well, we all know where we are, and that there is no, currently at least, there is no room for such talks about complementarity. Both Russia and the EU have understood that we do not have a common approach towards the issues of the security in the region. And here I would move to the second issue of the change of the global environment that pushed the European Union to verbalize its aim of being geopolitical, and the global environment that underlined that we all have came back to the predominant role of power in different aspects of power, to the increase of global competition between the United States and China, and to the relative decline of the level of Russia-EU relations for the global agenda. And again, the example, the case of the current Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict just underlines how far have we moved from this initial stage of interactions on the continent. The situation demonstrates that it is a clear shift from the so-called post-Soviet perspective. So there is no continuity with the 90s and understanding of how the things are regulated on the post-Soviet space. There is a clear shift towards the growing role of new regional actors, with Turkey like expressively coming to the region. And it has started earlier, but currently we see well, how it is evident. So it makes this region shifting from the post-Soviet and Russia-EU geography towards the like bigger Near East or whatever. And thus the relations with the EU are not being anymore included by Russian foreign policy in the strive of new regional balances. Because of these shifts, and I think it is really important, and I think that we will see the changes, the structural changes that are not because of Russia-EU relations, that are not derivative of Russia-EU relations, but that would further influence these cleavages between Russia and the EU, because there are less and less like common incentives to continue to try to find what to do within the bilateral relations. So I would say that yes, the world is changing, and Russia and the EU are changing with the world.
Let's stick to Russia. Stefan, Lehne, how should the EU behave towards Russia? And also, especially after what we've experienced in the last couple of weeks on the Navalny case, should the EU still seek dialogue with Moscow or further downgrade the relationship? And if the EU decides to engage further, would be like Federica Mogherini's suggestion for a selective engagement be a possibility? Would that be would that be a probable goal?
Well, I think the EU sort of slipped into a geopolitical competition with Russia around 2013, 2014, didn't want to. It considered the neighborhood policy and the DCFTA, this agreement with the Ukraine, as a win-win thing. They thought if Ukraine becomes richer and more stable, this is in the interest of all its neighbors. So we had this notion of this is something good for the region as such. And that was a bit naive, because Mr. Putin had very different ideas. He looked at it in terms of a geopolitical competition, of a zero-sum game, basically. Every step the Ukraine would do towards the EU would be a step away from Russia, basically. And therefore he reacted in a very violent and very tough manner. I think the game is not over, it's ongoing. Basically, Russia has won the Crimea and maybe some bits of Ukraine, but it lost the rest of the Ukraine. And I think Putin is not reconciled with the status quo. I think he will continue to push towards a situation when there is a government in Kiev that is oriented towards Moscow. He has said frequently that he doesn't consider the Ukraine as an independent state, but as part of Russia as such. So the EU was able to agree on sanctions against Russia, which was surprising, because the member states had very diverse views towards Russia, some very friendly, some quite hostile, particularly the ones for the part that used to be part of the former Soviet Empire. but thanks to Merkel mainly, it was possible to find a common ground on the sanctions policy. But, and this has been going on ever since. It's very interesting that about 8 countries in the EU who would like to end the sanctions tomorrow, including Austria. But nobody is prepared to pay the political cost of telling Macron and Merkel and the Americans that we are blocking the next renewal of the sanctions. Just one president or prime minister would have to raise his hand and the sanctions regime would collapse. But nobody does it. Year after year, this is continuing. But the other side of the coin is that the EU policy towards Russia is pretty much paralyzed. There have been initiatives by Steinmeier when he was foreign minister. There is now a big initiative by Emmanuel Macron to bring sort of a new dynamism into the relationship. Macron said it very clearly. I think he said it best at the Munich Security Conference. He says the big rivalry of the next decades is the one between the US and China. And he thinks that Russia right now has a very hostile relationship to the US and to Europe, but a fairly cozy, positive one towards China. And he says, if you look at the power relationship between China and Russia, doesn't make much sense. I think there are very worrying aspects, basically, for Russia. So it would be in Russia's interest to open up, at least to Europe, where there is a lot in common and where one could do a great deal together. The problem with all these initiatives that have happened in the past is that the Russians don't move, basically. They don't seem to be interested. They seem to have convinced themselves with their own propaganda that somehow the EU is no longer relevant and unimportant, and the only thing that really counts is the kind of power status of Russia at the very top with the US and China, and a very strong relationship with China. So I think as long as Putin believes that a certain level of antagonism with Europe is part of kind of the business model of the regime to maintain stability, as long as that continues, I'm a bit doubtful that the EU can achieve much in the relationship with Russia. It's very sad because I think one could do a great deal together.
Yeah. Let's move to our common neighborhood. Andreas Schieder, you have been working on the situation in Belarus a lot in the last couple of weeks. The protests in Belarus against Lukashenko could become another very controversial factor between Russia and the EU. We discussed before that Cyprus is blocking sanctions due to the situation between with Turkey. How do you think should the EU proceed? With whom should Brussels speak in Minsk? And realistically, do you think the EU will be able to have an influence on the further developments in Belarus?
The last question of you is, I think, the most difficult because sometimes it's not easy to say if it will be successful or not, especially in this situation where, of course, Lukashenko is searching close support from Putin. But I think we have to be also clear, it is not Ukraine, and we should also not repeat those steps which maybe were not very wisely from the European Union on the Ukraine issue. This means, I think we have to be clear that we do not want to have any change of geopolitical situation. What we are talking about is simply that the Belarus people had been stolen their elections. And they need to get it back, and what they need to get is democracy. So this means what we ask for is new elections under maybe democratic and OSCE surveillance, and giving the way free for democracy. Second point, so we want no change of geopolitical framework. We want to have democracy there. And thirdly, what is the tool of our politics is really sanctions. And when we speak about sanctions, it's not only the classical tool of sanctions, it's also about these sanctions which are hitting personally the leader and his supporters in person. So freezing their bank accounts, limiting their travel possibilities and things like this is important. Of course, we in the European Parliament, also to make clear, because when said Europe does not know what to do, it was the European Parliament the first time Tikhanovskaya, one of the leaders of the democratic opposition and demonstrations on the street, was speaking in the parliament and speaking not only to the parliament but to the whole world, and giving also what she thinks it is necessary, which is also, I think, in line with the points I said. And then what I do not understand is, like KATI PIRI was saying before, is that one country is blocking effective sanctions. It sounds really weird, because you can have both. You can have sanctions against Turkey because of drilling in Cypriot and Greek waters, and sanctions against Lukashenko and his regime. So there is no contradiction in this. So therefore, it's even less understandable what to do. Because of course, it is not very supportive that it now takes more than 1 month that the European Union is giving these sharp answers. We have a long list of sanctioned people from the Ukraine, but we have only a short proposal list of sanctions from Belarus, and this, I think, is not in balance now.
Thank you very much. I think you already built the link to Turkey now. I apologize for jumping around between the countries, but as we heard before, everything is very much interlinked. So, KATI PIRI, I would like to ask you on your opinion to Turkey, as you are a former rapporteur in the European Parliament on Turkey. You know the situation with the country very well. Turkey is both a partner of the EU in many fields, but also is viewed as a threat to at least 2 member states, Cyprus and Greece, also at the moment. Also, there are many diverging interests between the EU and, or many countries of the EU and Turkey concerning Syria, Libya, now the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and so on. How should the EU behave towards Turkey, and how can the EU deal with also a political figure such as Erdogan, who is probably himself a big challenge?
Yeah. Well, thank you for this impossibly big question. I mean,
sorry,
we could no. I mean, I don't blame you. I mean, I'll try to answer shortly, but I think after dealing with Turkey intensively now for 6 years, I could write a whole book about just trying to answer this question. Very general remarks, because it's difficult to go into details in a short time. I think we have to make a distinction between the Turkish government and its citizens. The same applies, of course, when we speak about Russia. But, you know, very often in Europe, what I see in the Netherlands, and I assume is the same in Austria, we have a very black and white picture about Turkey. I remember when the opposition is winning elections in the local elections, then in the Netherlands, no one understands it, because isn't Erdogan a dictator who controls the whole country? How could the opposition win the elections? Not to say that Turkey is a perfectly functioning democracy, but we sometimes like to view it in a very black and white way. And to be honest, and then of course I come to the criticism, we also have and always had extreme double standards vis-a-vis Turkey. And I'll be the first one to admit it, although I was for 5 years the Turkey rapporteur. And still I'm a persona non grata in Turkey because of the criticism, and here it comes. Of course, I'm extremely concerned about the path that Erdogan is taking the country on. When it comes about human rights abuses, we have seen some years we were hopeful about the peace talks with the Kurds. We see that only last week, 82 politicians were again arrested. We have the main opposition leader, Demirtas and Yüksekdag, in jail. Osman Kavala''s case, a well-known NGO activist, was supposed to be, after 3 years, the High Court, the Constitutional Court, was supposed to give a verdict on his case. It has been postponed. I can continue when it comes to freedom of the media, the lack of independence of the judiciary. I'm extremely concerned about the state that Turkey is in. And I do believe that we need to be very firm and principled when it comes to these issues. And very often we are mixing them up with all kinds of other issues like trade or migration, and we fail to stand up for the Democrats in Turkey as the EU. In terms of foreign policy, whether, it's very specific, of course, each case, but whether we speak about Libya or Syria or now what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean, like some other big countries do as well, foreign policy is a reflection of trying to divide attention from the internal policy, and very often about problems with the economy, which are ongoing and rally around the flag. It's a proud country. Even the biggest opposition party wouldn't dare to criticize, at least not criticize heavily, any of the foreign policy decisions of President Erdogan. So they know this is a way to take away some heat also from the opposition. So what the EU should do, like I said, principled and strong stance on fundamental rights. It's funny that the first time that the EU leaders are discussing sanctions is because of drillings in a sea. Now, I don't want to jeopardize it, but after everything that happened inside Turkey, I would be very angry if I would be a Turkish Democrat or a member of the opposition or a civil society activist, that the EU never tried to even think or threaten with sanctions after everything that happened inside Turkey when it comes to human rights in the previous years. But when it is about drilling vis-a-vis one EU member state, we immediately come with the tool of sanctions. So this is a kind of double standard. When it touches our interest, we care. When it touches the interest of the Turkish democratic society, those people who don't vote for Erdogan, and they are still and growing more than, around 50%, then we never talk about these type of measures. Of course, we need to cooperate on migration and energy, but what we would need to do most is use our economic leverage. Turkey is an open economy. It does not have oil. It does not have these, it's not Azerbaijan, it's not Russia. It needs to have an open economy. Its biggest trade partner is the European Union, and we always fail to use this economic tool. And I don't mean in terms of sanctions, but I mean in terms of carrots, of trying to push forward reforms in turn for more and diversified trade. I also believe that it's useless to even pretend that we are talking about accession with Erdogan. So the parliament has been clear and outspoken about this. Let's stop pretending that we are talking with this Turkey about EU accession. Having said all that, Turkey is too big to ignore. And we have too many interests together to just think, well, if we are just tough about Erdogan, or if we just say we need to have sanctions because of the drillings in the Eastern Mediterranean, we have a Turkey policy. This is not a Turkey policy. And unfortunately, the EU has failed in the last years to come up with a real EU-Turkey policy. In contradiction to ANDREAS, although we are working closely together and we are members of the same political family, I do not think that sanctions to Turkey should be applied in this case, but that's my personal opinion. I'm not representing my group here. We're talking also about NATO countries. We're talking about having a sanction policy towards a NATO country, not having said, or at least not only sanctions because of what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean, where, to be honest, we never talk about the Turkish Cypriot community and how, of course, whatever comes from the drillings should also be to their benefit. I know in the Netherlands, sometimes when you hold these type of stories about Turkey, on the one hand, you are praised by the extreme right for being extremely tough on Erdogan, and it makes you a persona non grata in Turkey. On the other hand, when sometimes I try to have the nuanced view, you are seen as a person defending the autocrat Erdogan. I just try to be honest and blunt from my experience the last 6 years with the countries, that we need a much more forward-looking, deeper strategy than just threatening with sanctions. I mean, our interests are too big for that, and I'm afraid it will not cause anything on the short term. So I'm more in line with the German position, what Angela Merkel is trying to do, and that is trying to avoid further escalation in the Eastern Mediterranean. I'm happy to see that also the Greek government is in line with that. So let's all hope that the threat of sanctions will not lead to having to have the sanctions in the end.
Thank you very much, KATI PIRI, for this very outspoken and clear outline of your position. I would like to round up a little bit the debate until now and come back to LEYLA. KATI PIRI mentioned in her first statement the buzzword strategic autonomy. As an expert on security policy, I'd like to ask you what is actually meant by strategic autonomy of the EU, and also how can it be achieved?
Yeah, well, it's a very current topic. So I think you raised exactly the right question. The question is strategic autonomy to do what? So I think what it means is that we need to be able to first have and then to protect our own interest as Europeans, as the European Union. But this also means autonomous decision making. So somebody has mentioned this before. It takes political will as a prerequisite to even come to that point, I think. I do not think that strategic autonomy means that by implementing our own strategic interests once defined, that we cannot cooperate with our international partners still. I think it just means that we do not have to, or we wouldn't have to, in the worst case. Bluntly and very practically speaking, I think it would mean to be able to act for the European Union where it isn't necessarily in a clear United States interest to act. So that would bring us in defense terms in regions such as West Africa and the Western Balkans. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. We are ending the live stream here. Thank you very much to everybody who was watching from home. Hope to see you soon.